My last video covered what WoW felt like in vanilla. It's worth stating that vanilla had a lot of hints in it that there was more to the world than met the eye. There were portals here and there to the Emerald Dream, and of course there was the Dark Portal. None of those portals did anything when you walked through them, of course, and then the Burning Crusade came out. And did we ever see an amazing world on the other side of the Dark Portal? There were truly alien animals, races that we had never seen before. There was even truly alien geology. It is hard to imagine what kinds of forces could shape the Blade's Edge Mountains. And the whole thing leaves me wondering where exactly they got the inspiration for some of this stuff. In terms of the leveling, the Burning Crusade was a lot like vanilla on steroids. Once again, there wasn't that much story in each of the zones. There were a few quests explaining what different factions were trying to accomplish, but once again, by and large, there was no unifying story. It was more like, hey, the Dark Portal opened up. There's a bunch of demons over there. Hey, adventurers, hop in and see what you can do. That was nearly it in terms of the plot line, and once again, Outland was like a big open sandbox where you never quite knew what was around the corner. That being said, the land itself seemed to tell some stories. Some of the tilted and broken-looking areas in Hellfire Peninsula told of a time when this was a much flatter area, probably from before Draenor was destroyed. Netherstorm and the force fields in it told the story of a land that was being torn apart by the twisting Nether, largely thanks to the technology that was drawing energy out of the Nether. And the shielded areas that still had life in them, wow. That told the story of what Netherstorm looked like before Draenor was destroyed. Even on the Azeroth side of the Dark Portal, there's a show don't tell, where the Dark Portal itself is in the middle of a giant crater. Somehow that Dark Portal made that crater, and whether it's an explosion from inside the portal or the arrival of the portal, you don't know. But in any case, that portal is proving itself to be bad news. Now, the Burning Crusade was similar to Vanilla WoW in a lot of ways, and there are a lot of things that I didn't mention in the Vanilla video that probably deserved mention in retrospect, but which I either didn't think of or had to cut for time. But since the Burning Crusade was so similar to Vanilla, I figured I could get away with mentioning these things in my Burning Crusade video instead of my Vanilla video. And one of those things was hybridization. In vanilla, and at least while leveling in the Burning Crusade, it was okay to have a tank, a healer, 2 DPSers, and then a half-tank, half-healer in your 5-man. It was okay to have flexible roles in your 5-man dungeons, and since you're putting it together instead of the auto-match system, you can build your group however you like. It doesn't have to be 1 healer, 1 tank, and 3 DPS. And in fact, the roles are pretty flexible too. Because of the amount of health players had and the amount of damage monsters did, in a lot of cases, you didn't want too many enemies on your tank all at once. Some solutions to that are either to have an off-tank, that's right, an off-tank in a 5-man, I'm not joking, or use crowd control abilities like freeze trap, sap, polymorph, entangling roots, that kind of thing. It was also okay in vanilla in the Burning Crusade to have a healer and a half, so to speak. Group heals weren't particularly common, so having someone who can help your healer out was a big plus. And at least theoretically it was possible to spec yourself out so that you were half-tank, half-healer. I say theoretically because the real vital talents tended to be buried deep, but I'll elaborate on this later. In terms of post-leveling PvE progression, things once again got a lot more difficult. First of all, they added heroics for the first time. Generally the way things worked, at least when the Burning Crusade came out at first, was in order to get a key to even get into the heroic, you needed to grind reputation with a faction outside that heroic. And while Wrath of the Lich King and every expansion after it always had it set up so that heroics were intended to be tackled before raids, heroics in the Burning Crusade were as difficult to gear up for as raids. Back in the Burning Crusade, I only ever tried to get into one heroic, and it was very clear that I was not geared up enough to go in there, because as the main healer, everybody else in my party was hitting their oh-snap buttons while we were pulling the first few trash mobs. I ducked out of that heroic and never tried again. As for raids, Blizzard decided to change their philosophy. Instead of 20-man and 40-man raids, there were now 10 and 25-man raids. And I know what you're thinking right now. You're thinking, okay, that means every raid had a 10-man version and a 25-man version, right? Wrong. That 2-version system hadn't been invented yet. The 10-man progression included things like Karazhan and Zul'Aman, while the 25-man version included things like Tempest Keep, Magtheridon, the Black Temple, etc. Raids were even harder to get into in the Burning Crusade than they were in vanilla, but the gear they rewarded tended to be flashier, so it was even more rewarding than vanilla when you did get something, with the exception of Crystal Forge. While I found our tier set unimpressive, there is one thing that I liked about tier sets. Blizzard decided to nerf the random number gods in the Burning Crusade. In vanilla, the way you got pieces of armor for your tier sets was this. You went into raids, you hoped that at some point during your run, the pieces you were missing would drop. Some of them dropped off of bosses, some even dropped off of trash mobs. The probability was low, and when there are 40 people in your raid, the probability that you'd actually get a piece when one dropped was even lower. For that matter, it was possible for Shaman gear to drop for Alliance runs and for Paladin gear to drop for Horde runs. Lest it be forgotten, before the Burning Crusade, Paladins were Alliance only and Shaman were Horde only. The Burning Crusade didn't just change that, it also changed the way tier pieces dropped. Tier pieces did not directly drop off of bosses, instead, tokens dropped off of those bosses. And any given token would be of use to at least 3 different classes. A token could be turned into a vendor in exchange for a tier piece. The fact that a given token was useful to at least 3 different classes meant that the likelihood of a useless drop was nearly nil. Also, the Burning Crusade introduced the Badge of Justice system, which was a precursor to the Justice and Valor Point system. Badges dropped off of heroic and raid bosses and could be used to purchase epic level gear. So even if you didn't get any gear drops from a given successful boss fight, at least you got one step closer to getting some gear as a consolation prize. These changes really helped to nerf the random number gods and made the game less frustrating and more rewarding. That is, for those of us who actually managed to get into these really difficult raids and heroics. Another thing which I didn't mention in vanilla which made a comeback in the Burning Crusade was attunement quests. They were long quests that required groups and that led you into raids. They existed in vanilla with things like Reginald Windsor, but they were even longer and harder in the Burning Crusade than they were in vanilla. Eventually, Blizzard began making quality of life improvements, and then they did away with the attunement quests and just let anybody get into those raids. Needless to say, the people who did those quests weren't very happy. Another type of quest that became less common in the Burning Crusade was class-specific quests. I remember that while I was leveling my paladin, there were things like Varigan's Fist, quests to learn Redemption, there was a quest chain for getting your charger. All of that was part of the leveling process and really made it feel like your class had a specific identity. There were similar things for warlocks to get their mounts. Priests had a quest to get a morphing staff called Benediction and/or Anathema, and I know that there was a druid quest line to get an epic flying form, but other than that, I don't remember any class-specific quests from the Burning Crusade. With fewer class-specific quests in the game has lost a lot of the feeling that your class has a unique identity in the world of Azeroth, and I'm kind of hoping that Blizzard considers class-specific, repeatable scenarios that show off what your class can do and what you'd expect someone with those abilities to be called on to do. For instance, I could see a Shaman scenario where there's an enemy who can only be harmed by alternating fire, nature, and frost damage. Or imagine a Paladin scenario where they're asked to use Cleanse to halt an epidemic. There's so much to be said about the Burning Crusade, I can't cram it all into one video. I think we're going to have to go into 2 or maybe even 3 parts on this one.